This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Kicking off today's show is K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with another episode of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast. This week, the pair discusses how to grow big fish in ponds. K-State Extension beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff continues the show by talking about the different reasons cattle could be lame and how to identify them. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends today's show by discussing the expansion taking place within the dairy industry, including Kansas, and where profitability on dairy farms might be headed. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers from K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts and K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. This week, Drew and Joe talk about how to grow big fish in ponds.
We're going to talk about how to get some of the fish in your ponds to be big fish, something that maybe is a trophy-level fish or something on the bigger side. That takes some planning. Thought we could chat a little bit about that.
So where do we start if we're thinking about managing for big fish in a pond?
Habitat in a pond is where we really need to start. And so having a diverse array of habitats is going to be really important. Somewhere around 20% of our surface area should have some sort of habitat or structure on it. And so thinking about that, diversity is really important in the habitat. And so a lot of people want to have big fish, and so what do they put habitat out for? They put habitat out for big fish. But what we really need to be thinking about is having places for those big fish to hide and ambush the prey. But also it's important for those little prey to be able to get away and have areas where they can hide and be able to escape predation so that they can grow up later and have, bigger prey items for the bigger fish in your pond. So that habitat management, if you haven't listened to that episode 5, go back, and I would start there, kind of listening to that a little bit.
What about harvest? I mean, can we have sort of the best of both worlds and keep some fish out of our pond and grow big fish, or is it one of those deals where you get one or the other?
Sure. Yeah, one of the biggest myths that I think I fight out there is that you can't keep any fish out of your pond. And I get people all the time that tell me they love fish and they'd love to be able to eat some fish out of their pond, but they're not utilizing them at all.
Yeah.
And that's because we've been trained that catch and release is great. And catch and release is fantastic, and it's fantastic in public waterways where there's a lot of pressure, for example. Most private ponds don't have enough pressure, and so harvest is an important part of that management strategy. So being able to catch fish and harvest certain ones. Now, a caveat to that is we generally want to let the bigger fish go and keep the smaller fish. And so you think about going out and having some fun with your buddy, catching some fish. You catch a really big lunker, you want to go show that off, right? You don't want to necessarily keep a bunch of 1 pound 12 or 14-inch fish. You want to keep the bigger ones, but keeping those smaller ones is generally what's recommended. And keeping, this surprises people too, the average amount that you should keep a year is 25 pounds of largemouth bass per surface acre per year. And so that adds up pretty quick. If you're thinking about harvesting those throughout the year, that's quite a few bass.
So should we remove any of those large bass, or should we only remove the little ones?
Yeah, so a good place to start is the little ones. Again, this is kind of, if you're just going out, you're not fishing your pond all the time, really striving to get the 20 to 25 pounds of those small fish out per year is important. If you're going to be the type of fisherman or the type of pond owner that's really excited about managing the fish population, you want to get those big trophy fish, you're going to have to remove some of the higher slot fish. And so you're going to want to remove some 3-pound, 5-pound, even some 8-pound fish, right? But you have to know what your fish population structure is before you start to do that. That's an area where really, if you're going to get to that management level, you should be reaching out to your local extension agent, me, or a professional, and getting some insight on what does your population structure really look like. Do you have enough fish? How many of these bigger fish do you have? Taking it back, we've been talking about bass a lot, but going back to the bluegill side of things, what does the forage base look like, right? Making sure all of those parameters kind of exist. And then you'd want to start thinking about maybe taking out some of those bigger mouths so that there's more prey available and you can get the really big trophy fish.
You mentioned starting small, so, I mean, if we're thinking about the forage base, how should we manage our bluegill population?
Yeah, and getting big fish really goes back to managing the bluegill. And I know it's not as exciting for most people, but managing your bluegill population is the key to getting big fish. So managing your bluegill population, harvesting those smaller bass, those two things alone get you 80% of the way there, right? And so thinking about having those different habitats that we've talked about, remembering it takes 10 pounds of forage to gain a pound of bass, right? So somewhere around that. So that's a lot of bluegill that you need to have.
Yeah.
And one of the benefits of bluegill is they're spawning 2 to 3 times a year in Kansas, and so that's some of the benefit of the bluegill there. But if we're talking about getting bigger bass like to eat fish that are on average 20 to 45% of their overall length, right? So we're talking about a 4 or 5 pound bass. We're talking about somewhere between 20, 22 inches. And so we start to think about a quarter to half of that. That's a big bluegill, right? And so managing the population of bluegill, you got to manage those so that the little ones can grow up into medium ones and the medium ones can grow up into big ones. And so that takes a lot of effort to manage there. And having a variety of that habitat is really important, making sure that those different size structures have places to hide and have places to grow up. So lots to do there. I'm going to briefly mention the genetics here too, because there's something called a copper-nosed bluegill that's really popular. They're more aggressive. They tend to grow faster. They still have small mouths, so they don't compete as much with the bass as some other species. One of the things with thinking about the genetics of bluegill is that they reproduce really often, right? We're getting 2 or 3 generations a year. And so when you start to see that kind of reproduction, there's a lot of fluctuation in the genetics and maintaining those genetics over time. The research has shown that's really hard to do, right? People that are really good at that have a hard time maintaining it. Generally, it takes some sort of feeding program in order to get those fish to get big and stay big.
You mentioned feeding fish there a couple of times. Is that something that we want to be doing to grow big fish, or how do we need to think about that?
You know, feeding fish is something, if you want to get really big fish, that is one of the steps that you can take. And again, there's an expense related to that, and it's something that you need to do. If you're going to feed the fish, the research is very strong that the quality of feed matters. So do a little bit of research, figure out some quality fish food that you like. You're going to get better growth. You're going to get better value for your money. So it might be more upfront cost, but the growth rates, you can often have lower input costs, and all that matters. So quality feed would matter. A couple things. When we're talking about feeding fish, it's very, very hard to feed train largemouth bass. So most of the time when we're feeding fish, we're going to be feeding bluegill populations. We've talked before about carrying capacities in ponds, right? So carrying capacities is there's a limited amount of food in that pond, and if we exceed that, then all of our fish aren't going to get the right amount of food, right? And so if you start to feed fish, you're going to increase that carrying capacity. You're going to have more mouths that can survive in that pond. But it's important that we keep that carrying capacity high. And so if you're going to start feeding fish, it needs to be something that you consistently feed those fish over time. And if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that your fish are feed trained. So you can either buy them feed trained, or you can just start by, slowly adding food to the system. Fish are pretty smart. After a couple weeks, they'll start to figure it out, and then you can ramp up your feeding rates at that time. But again, feeding is great, something that you need to do. Quality feed, and once you start, stick with it, right?
So do we need to harvest more if we're feeding them? Is that something we need to think about?
Yeah, you're going to have more prey, more mouths. They're going to be reproducing more, and so you might need to alter your harvest strategies there, right, to make sure that you're keeping up with the increased reproductive rates. The flip side of that is we're feeding them more too, right? So we've increased that carrying capacity, so it might be that balances out. What I would do is make sure that you're harvesting that recommended rate. And then if you start to see, all your fish are getting small, or you're seeing a really high abundance of certain fish, either start to harvest those or reach out to a fisheries professional, your local extension agent, or me, and we'll be happy to look at your pond and kind of give you some suggestions there.
So, Joe, we've talked about a whole bunch of different things. What are the biggest take-home messages if I got a pond and I'm wanting to have big bass in that pond?
Sure. A couple things. One, make sure you're getting out there and having fun and fishing it, right? And so fishing is an important management tool. I think a lot of times when I talk to people, they're hesitant to fish, or they think that's going to be bad for the population. Fishing and harvesting is really important. Thinking about some of those other steps, if you want to, think about genetics, you can do that. You can have big bass without worrying about the genetics too. You can have big bass without worrying about adding expensive fish feed into your pond. But that's going to take some time managing that habitat a little bit. So I think harvest, habitat management, focusing on those things and having a plan. I talk about having a plan all the time. That's really important. Growing these big fish is great, but no real sense in doing that if you're not going to get out and have fun and catch some of these fish too.
Sure.
So make sure you get a pole, go out there. These bigger fish, remember, they're eating 20 to 45% of their body length as their ideal food. So you got to have some big lures if you're going to go catch a big bass, right? So get out there, have fun, make sure that you're doing those things we talked about, and send me some pictures of those big fish you catch.
That sounds awesome. Well, hope everybody gets out and catches some big bass. Thanks, everybody. If you got an idea for us, send it to us, and we'll talk at you next time.
Once again, that was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken. If you'd like to listen to this full episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, you can do so by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by going to the podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you have questions that you'd like answered by Drew and Joe, you can submit them by finding their contact information, once again in today's show notes, or by going to wildlife.k-state.edu. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about lameness in cattle. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Extension beef veterinarian AJ Tarpoff. AJ, thanks for joining us today.
Always a pleasure to be in.
AJ, as we talk about a few different ways that lameness can happen in cattle, first mentioning that if your cattle are lame, it impacts more than just their mobility.
It really does. So lameness is a major concern in all sectors of the beef industry. If we raise cattle, obviously locomotion is a very important thing. So think about it, the true economic cost of a lameness or an infection, something impeding its mobility. It depends on what we're asking that animal to do. If this is a stocker calf and we're asking it to go out and graze, burn Flint Hills grass, it may not be moving and grazing as much as what it should be. It's going to lay down. It's painful. It doesn't want to get out and consume feed and grow. So reduce performance, reduce feed efficiency. But also some of the hidden costs of lameness. If we get into our breeding herd, right, and we're asking our breeding bull to do his job, if he comes up lame and he no longer is out breeding our cows, now we can have a delayed economic impact of, increase open rates, reduce reproduction rates. That's a huge economic driver of our cow-calf operations, and that can be very detrimental, especially in single sire groups.
And first, thinking about ways to hopefully prevent even having lameness, and thinking about what your pin set it might be as people are working cattle this time of year.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now is the time of year. We're getting ready to go to grass. Here we are, early May. So if folks are out there, it's quote unquote branding season. So we're running cattle through. We might be, providing some, early season animal health products like vaccines. Before you work cattle, please, please, please have a real, close, thorough assessment of your working facilities. The worst thing that we want to, have happen is us cause a lameness. So inspect the floors of your handling chute. Make sure all the gates are swinging appropriately, making sure that there's nothing sharp or pokey that can cause some type of wound, right? If we get a wound over a joint, that can be very detrimental. So have a good, thorough assessment, making sure everything's in working order before we start sending animals through a processing facility.
Is it also worth people checking out their pasture to hopefully prevent foot rot?
Absolutely. So pastures are where the majority of our summer-grown, pasture-based lameness occurs. So simple things, wire, right? Cattle can get wrapped up in a number of different things. So if there's excess wire, especially smooth wire that can get wrapped around feet, making sure that we're getting that picked up to make sure our cattle don't get tangled up into something like that. But also thinking about our watering sites, right? Having a easy access that's not going to impede. You mentioned foot rot. Foot rot is a bacterial infection underneath the skin of the foot. In order for that condition to happen, we need to break down in the skin barrier. Right? So if we're going to break down the skin barrier, it's something abrasive. I see more foot issues and some of those infectious foot rot problems in scenarios where animals wade into ponds and spend a long time stomping through the mud to be able to get to water or to get away from flies, or two, around water tanks where there's a mixture of mud and gravel, some really abrasive type structures around a water tank. So those are areas to focus on, that if we can improve that, to have easy access for those animals to get the water, that they're not going to be walking through a lot of abrasive substances. We want to protect our animals as much as we can.
And how can cattle producers identify that is likely foot rot in their livestock?
Yeah, let's talk about a couple of the different key causes of pasture lameness. We alluded to foot rot earlier. Foot rot sometimes is a catch-all. It's like, oh, an animal's lame, it's foot rot. Untrue, okay? Every lameness is not foot rot. Foot rot is a very specific condition. I mentioned a break in the skin. So foot rot is a bacterial infection caused by a common bacteria in the environment. It's found in the digestive tract of cattle. It's found in manure. It's found in the soil. It's Fusobacterium, the same bacteria that's known to cause liver abscesses. So very common in the environment, very commonly held and carried in cattle. But in order for this bacteria to set up shop, in the foot to cause these lameness issues, it has to have an access point. That's where we get a breakdown in the skin barrier. So to help troubleshoot what's foot rot and what's not foot rot, it's very indicative. And those that are listening, I'm sure, know the smell of foot rot. We have some folks and some producers that can walk in, downwind of their herd and can smell foot rot from 30 yards away. So it does have a very pungent odor that some people are more sensitive to. They can pick that up from a distance, which is pretty helpful in diagnosing. But really, we find the lameness. When you go and check over pasture cattle, it's really important to check locomotion. It's sometimes we want to shy away that we have a group of cows all resting, everybody's looking good, we want to leave them be. We do need to get those animals to stand up and actually move so we can truly assess their locomotion. If they're lame, right, that's when we get a good, thorough assessment. And guess what? 90% of all lamenesses in cattle are found in the foot. So we start with the foot and work up. Foot rot, one thing that's really indicative and easy to diagnose is the foot itself will be swollen. Okay, so just above the hoof walls on both sides, we have a symmetric swelling, both sides of the foot. We have this equal swelling because it's a subcutaneous, just underneath the skin infection. So if it's swollen similarly on both sides, we can feel fairly confident that it's foot rot.
What if it's not swollen similarly on both sides?
Yeah, that's what we refer to as asymmetric swelling, so only swelling on one side. If you run into that condition, if you see a lame animal, it's only swollen on one toe, so to speak, that's a very sinister scenario. Time is of the essence. That is an animal that needs veterinary care pretty quickly. When we see unilateral or one-sided swelling, more commonly that's associated with deep infections. When we think about the lower foot, the only structures that are there are joints, bones, and tendons. And if we get an infection into any of those, that's bad. Okay, that's a really bad scenario. We can, get some good therapy into those animals. We can cure a lot of those animals, but the quicker that we get those assessed and done, usually at a veterinary clinic. So we'll have to lay those animals down, have to get a thorough exam of that foot. We'll have to do some creative treatments to get those animals back to sound.
What if that animal gets up and is moving around, still not as it should be, but doesn't look like there's any swelling?
Yeah, so no swelling. So that's where, we start looking elsewhere. We always start in the foot. Now, once we see that animal walk, even if there's no swelling, we still need to start down low. There is a condition that we occasionally see in pasture cattle, not extremely, common in pasture cattle, but we'll see it in feedlots and we'll see it in dairy cattle. But it's called strawberry foot rot. It's called digital dermatitis. It's called hairy heel warts. So some of you may have heard one or more of those conditions, but all those fancy names refer to it's It's a hairy heel wart is kind of what we think about it, but they walk on their tippy toes. They're almost three-legged lame. It's very painful. You go, it's like, oh my goodness, this animal might have a broken leg. They act so lame. But really, it's just a skin infection. They'll walk on their tippy toes on either a front leg or a back leg, and we start to look at that, go up behind them, and there'll be either these growth-like that looks like warts on the back of their heel bulbs of their foot, or it's even bright cherry red. That's where the strawberry foot rot comes from. But one thing that's different with that, it's infectious. We don't 100% know what causes it or how it happens. One thing we know for sure is we need topical therapy. If we treat with just injectable antibiotics like we do foot rot, there will be no recovery time, so that they don't get better with just an injection. They do need topical treatment, and you can work with your local veterinarian to have some of those treatments.
Are there things when it comes to lameness that are a little bit more specific to usually bulls or calves having them?
Okay, so no swelling in the foot. So we started low, doesn't have hairy heel. Then we start looking at the other joints. So we can have some different scenarios with either our breeding animals or our young calves. We start looking further up the legs. We can see big swellings at either the big joints, right? The stifle or the hock of the back leg, or the carpus and the elbow or the shoulder of the front leg. So if we see swelling in some of those key locations, that may tell us that we have something going on with one of the joints, whether traumatic or infectious. So with our breeding animals, usually our bulls, right? Our bulls are athletes. They're out there doing a job, but unfortunately they can get some athletic injuries. One of which is called a torn cranial cruciate ligament. It's an ACL tear. Many folks, hear about ACL tears in football players. If they cut a different way, well, think about a 2,000-pound bull that twists the wrong way while they're out there working. Guess what? They can actually rupture that ligament, and that can be very detrimental to them. That can end their breeding season. So again, if you see a big swollen stifle, it's up by the belly, that big knee joint in the back leg of a bull, that could have been a traumatic injury. Now our calves, whether it's a weaned stocker animal or a young spring-born animal, if we get those big joints that are swollen, we have to think septic arthritis. So for that weaned calf, some of the same bugs that cause pneumonia and cause lung infections, some of those pathogens can get into the bloodstream and seed into those joints, causing these nasty infections. So those big joints, we think they're bacterial caused in calves. For the young calf, it may have had not enough colostrum intake, and we could have had some septicemia, is what we call it, bacteria going through the system, and they can seed into those joints, causing these big blown-up joints, very lame. It takes a long time to recover from those. We can treat them systemically and get rid of some of the bacteria, so to speak, but it's going to be a long rest and recovery time for them to fully recover.
AJ, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and talk us through some different reasons why cattle might be lame.
Absolutely.
That was K-State Extension beef veterinarian AJ Tarpoff. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead.
From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Kansas dairy producers might not really be liking what they're seeing right now in terms of prices, but K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says there is a reason to be optimistic. This week he discusses the expansion taking place within the industry, especially in Kansas, and how that will aid the dairy industry. He also has information on where profitability on dairy farms might be headed.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy industry concerning expansion in our industry and also where we might be headed with profitability on our dairy farms. It's very interesting here in the United States. We've seen a great interest in expanding the dairy processing industry, and this is something that's not going on in other parts of the world and is really very unique to the United States. During the years from 2023 through 2025, we expect to see over $6 billion invested in milk processing across the United States. And this will be in various facilities. And here in Kansas, we're going to benefit from what's going on down in Dodge City. with a new Hilmar plant there. So we're seeing a rapid expansion of dairy processing. And as we think about that, as dairy producers, one of the questions that might come to your mind is, where is the milk going to come from? And that is a concern that's being addressed. We are seeing some farms expand here in Kansas as well as in neighboring states to increase the amount of milk produced here in our area to help supply that new plant that's being built in Dodge City. As we look around the United States, though, this may be a little more difficult than what one might think. You know, in the past, we've enjoyed a surplus of dairy heifers available as we wanted to expand the dairy herd. Although today that is not true, as we see our dairy heifer herd in the United States actually the smallest that it's been in a long, long time. And as we look at it as a percentage of the total cow herd in the United States, our current number of animals ready to calve will only be about 28% of the milking herd size. So this is going to limit the expansion of the dairy herd to meet the demand that is created by these new plants that we're building to process milk. So what does that mean for you as an individual dairy farm? Well, I know right now as we look at that milk price and we see it slip into the summer months, you're probably not too encouraged by what you're seeing. However, as we think about longer term and the demand that there will be for raw milk, this increased processing capabilities will likely result in an increased demand for milk. Now, your raw milk is going to be needed because we actually do need to expand the amount of dairy product that's available to consumers, not only in this country but also abroad as we think of exports. So the reason we're seeing a lot of expansion in the dairy processing industry is the fact that there is a need for increased volume of dairy product for the grocery shelves here in the United States as well as abroad. So long term, that means that we should see a higher demand for raw milk to fill those processing plants. If we have a limit on how fast we can expand herds, that should mean that we should see some increases in the prices that you receive on your farms. So as we look to the future, I think the future of the dairy industry, particularly in terms of this increased dairy processing capabilities, will actually work to improve the financial situation on our dairy farm by leading to higher prices for our raw milk. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to look to the bright future of our dairy industry here in the United States.
Thanks, Mike. And this reminder to listen to Agriculture Today anytime, go to agtoday.net, where you can listen on demand and find links to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Stitcher Radio. That's agtoday.net. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.